Hey, I'm Gary Richard Arnold, and we're filming in Santa Cruz early in March 2015. And across me is Chris Bollyn, and I'm going to let him give his bona fides. I was able to hear him the other night, and he was right on with information about 9/11. And I know there's controversy out there from time to time, but I think it's a lot like the blind men around the elephant, where one grabs a leg and they declare that that's it and only it, or somebody grabs a tail and thinks it's like a rope and it's only a rope over their dead body. But I think we have to share the information to see what's going on, and Chris fulfills a lot of that necessity with his book and with his experience in studying 9/11. And Chris, if you could tell our audience a little bit about your background and why you're hanging in there some 12, 13 years later.
Sure. Well, I was an investigative journalist working for a weekly paper in Washington, D.C. In 2001, and I was passing through New York City on the day of 9/11, early in the morning. And when it happened, I knew this was going to change my life, and it fell right into my domain of the kinds of things that I investigate. And I started investigating right away and started writing about it in September 2001. And I looked at the things that were not being reported, or the things that were being omitted from the story. Primarily the evidence of explosions in the World Trade Center prior to the collapse, and also the evidence that Israeli agents had prior knowledge of the attacks. And based on that, I worked on a hypothesis that this was some sort of false flag attack meant to be blamed on Osama bin Laden and go to war in Afghanistan, and that the people, the true culprits behind it, were Israeli intelligence agencies and people that were supporting the Israeli agenda in the United States. And I wrote a book called Solving 9/11. I started putting that book together in 2007 after a court process in Chicago, and I wrote it in Europe, and I finished it in 2012, and it was published in the spring of 2012. It's two books, a set of two books. First one is called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and the second one is Solving 9/11, The Original Articles, which contains all the articles, 135 articles that I wrote over that 10, 11-year period about 9/11.
Now, a lot of this is about the blame game and how to switch the blame from the culprits to the patsies, pretty much what we saw with the JFK assassination.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people I know at the event the other night in which you were talking, when you were talking about the first bombing, I noticed a few in the audience didn't know what that was and
mm-hmm.
hadn't heard about it for the same reasons they hadn't heard a lot of the truth about the second.
Mm-hmm.
But can you review a little bit about I think it was 93,
yeah.
in which somebody was being set up as a patsy, but he protected
Right.
himself?
Right. Well, in 1993, the first bombing in the World Trade Center was done with the connivance and the support of the FBI. And that was the case where they prosecuted the crime in New Jersey, and the blind sheikh and several other people were found guilty of involvement in that conspiracy. That case was prosecuted by Michael Chertoff, who was then the attorney for the District of New Jersey. And he also was the person who wound up prosecuting, or should have prosecuted, the 9/11 attacks years later. And the first attack in 1993 resulted in some changes. First, it changed American public opinion and gave the American public the idea that Arabs were trying to blow up the World Trade Center. And there was even some sort of film later on made after the 93 attack where the final statement, I think, was some...
Now, if I interrupt you a little
Yeah.
bit here, who was it that actually came up with the explosives? Was it the Arabs?
No, it was reported in the New York Times that it was the FBI.
The FBI gave the Arabs the explosives, and were they phony explosives?
Well, there was something about there was a decoy. There was supposed to be a decoy truck, one that wouldn't blow up, or one that would blow up. But this was all being the creation of this bomb that went off was done with the connivance of the FBI. The FBI was involved in the production of the bomb that blew up, and the FBI had paid the Colonel Salem, I think his name was, the Egyptian informant, who basically corralled all the people that were involved in this conspiracy in New Jersey. And he was paid $1 million by the FBI. And this was all reported in the New York Times. This is not...
Now, this scenario has happened before. Like Oklahoma, I understand there was a son of some German intelligence, Strassmeyer or something like that, that hit a group of white separatists, and they corralled some white separatists to make them the patsies for the Oklahoma bombing.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, and thank God for local media at that time there are numerous accounts of multiple bombs throughout the building, and most of America thinks there was just the one bombing by McVeigh. But the scenario that you're telling, I think, is really important, and you repeat it again in the book. But I'll let you go on if you can remember where you were at before.
Well, what we're talking about here is that the FBI has been involved in planning and carrying out false flag attacks in the United States, and the '93 bombing at the World Trade Center, and as you said, Oklahoma City bombing at the Federal Building there. These were false flag attacks. These were attacks that were carried out by an agency with the FBI's help, and as you said, third parties were blamed, patsies were blamed, and this is exactly what we saw on 9/11 as well.
Now, I think you had 3 steps which makes their process successful, and of course one of them is hiding the evidence, and then of course the very conduit of information itself. Those who control the media seem to have a trigger on censorship, and maybe you could name a few of the main outfits and what their control is, or...
Yeah, well, as you said, to control a false flag operation, you need to control the investigation and access to the evidence. Then you need to control the interpretation in the media. And finally, you have to control the litigation. But when you talk about the interpretation, that's where the media plays its key role, because in a false flag terror attack like 9/11 or Oklahoma City or the '93 bombing, the false narrative has to be pushed out there quickly and thoroughly, so that the people are given this plausible explanation which they are likely to believe before they have time to even think about it.
Now that's the template, and even those that might be compartmentalized or still in the game hook onto that template and try to say nothing else but what was framed in that first presentation.
Right.
Because some of these outfits they're scattered all over the place, but when you look down, all 3 of our local papers are owned by Bill Gates. Before that, it was the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
And I look at the head of it, and it's the guy's last name is Loeb, and Karen House, related directly to Colonel Mandel House.
Right.
And then, of course, we have Bill Gates, who's head of the Bilderbergers, that's on this campaign to eliminate the population of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, you pick up the newspapers now, and they're I can't compare them to what they're so thin. I don't even know. It's thinner than a comic book.
Yes.
And it is laughable.
Yes.
But
yeah. Well, see, on 9/11, for example, we saw that this the BBC World Television, for example, had Ehud Barak, the Israeli former prime minister and defense minister and Israel's most highly decorated soldier, in the studio, in BBC World Studios in London, before the towers even fell. The towers had both been hit, but it appears that they had not yet collapsed. And he's explaining, he gives out this explanation with his pretty heavy Israeli accent, saying that the world will never be the same from today on. And he says, we know who's behind 9/11. He said, it's Osama bin Laden, and we know where Osama bin Laden is hiding. And he said, now is the time for the United States to begin an operational, concrete war on terrorism. And this is something that, the Israeli intelligence had been pushing on the world since 1979. They had been trying to get the United States to take up the gauntlet and wage war in the Arab countries that were, providing sanctuary or supporting resistance fighters against the Israeli occupation, namely Iraq. And so CNN picked up that same story, that official version that Ehud Barak put out there, that it was Osama bin Laden, and now is the time for America to go to war. And this false narrative, or this explanation, was put out there as I said, early on the day of 9/11, and it was repeated by Jerome Hauer in San Diego, who spoke on, I think, CNN or one of the major networks in this country. And so that, you know, before the day was over, September 11th, 2001, the false narrative had been distributed throughout the English-speaking world, throughout the whole world. They got their false narrative out there. Like Mark Twain says that, you know, lies go around the world 3 times before truth has a chance to pull its boots on.
Now this is a radical difference when Iraq was our supposed ally that we were supplying all this poison gas to go after the Kurds in Iran. And that was a pretty secular state that allowed Christians and Jews and people not to have to wear scarves, and it was probably one of the safer pro-Western countries in that region.
Yeah. Iraq was at the time the most technologically advanced Arab state. It was a state that had its own educational departments that brought people to a high level of education. Unlike, for example, Saudi Arabia, that, you know, depends a lot on foreign educated students and whatnot. Iraq was very highly advanced, and Iraq was also a big supporter of the Palestinian resistance, of course. But the key thing about this understanding of Iraq was a document that was released by the Project for a New American Century. In 2000, they issued a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, in which they said that the United States, in order to obtain global supremacy of full spectrum dominance,
they wanted a permanent presence there, and they were calling for a Pearl Harbor-like event.
Yes, and they were calling for the United States to invade and occupy Iraq, whether Saddam Hussein was on the throne or not. That's important. So that the fact that Saddam Hussein was, you know, the bad guy or not the bad guy was not really the issue.
Or if there were weapons of mass destruction or not.
Precisely.
The idea was the occupation that we,
Precisely.
I shouldn't say we, but the multinationals, bankers that run us, used to install and build their contracts.
And that was in the plan already in 2000. That was the Pinnacle document, which was signed onto by most of the major people in the Bush administration that came into power. And this document is what the United States then, you know, fell back on, and that's what they did.
And that's online, and you can see most of those people talking on Fox News. You can see them as candidates such as Jeb Bush. You said John Bolton, which appears like Yosemite Sam about every third day on Fox News, calling for a war.
Yeah, and Wolfowitz had signed on to the document. I think Dick Cheney had signed on to it. And it was a document that this PNAC group is interesting because it was founded by Donald Kagan and his son Robert and Fred.
His wife is Victoria Nuland, who just was handing out cookies to the rebels for their recent coup in the Ukraine.
And she's the one who called for the new Prime Minister of Ukraine to be Yatsenyuk 2 weeks before the overthrow of the elected government.
And McCain is a frequent visitor back and forth to this location. And Joe Biden's son got on the board of directors of their energy commission, which threw millions of dollars at Bilderberger, Joe Biden's son.
Yeah, and another thing about John McCain is that John McCain also visited the rebels in Syria, in Aleppo, Syria, in May 2013, and there he was talking to a man in a black shirt who has been identified as the Caliph of Islamic State. This is the man who runs Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL. And at the time that John McCain was speaking to him in May 2013, the State Department had a $10.5 million bounty for the arrest of this man that McCain was speaking to. So when I asked McCain's office to please identify the man that he was speaking to in that photo, they refused to identify him, because obviously there was a conflict there.
I know the turn of the century, what I ran across that I didn't know about, this very house here used to be a garage, a converted garage, and a nice little cottage that Dr. Anthony Sutton was living at.
Really?
And he received a stack of secret papers on Skull and Bones at this very address. And he had since gone on to write America's Secret Establishment, and knowing who those people were throughout history really changes history.
Right.
But we find out here that they're, according to a book called The Secret Episode in American Zionist History, 1975, and it gives the pages by Sarah Schmidt from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she talks about a secret society called Parishim. And Parishim was the heart of the conspiracy, and Brandeis was at the center of this. Now, Louis Brandeis, when you look up his background just in Wikipedia alone, he was critical in forming the Federal Reserve.
Yes.
The first head of the Federal Reserve was Pierre Jay, a member of Skull and Bones. So you've got the interchange, this marriage with him.
Yeah.
And he was also advocated entering World War I. He brokered an agreement for the creation of the Federal Reserve. A man, again from Wikipedia, this isn't from any of books that you can cast aspersions on, but Brandeis was the best known admired secular Jew in America. De Haas introduced him, Brandeis, to the ideas of Theodore Herzl and the ideas of Zionism. It said he would head the American Zionist movement by 1912, and he recruited Felix Frankfurter into Parishim, the Zionist secret society. Now, Felix Frankfurter was the assistant to Henry Stimson.
Right.
Now, Henry Stimson was Secretary of War for the First World War, and it was the British that told the American Jewish Committee that if they could get America into the war, if America would support them, then they would do the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
And so this was a quid pro quo, at least it appears that way.
Yeah.
So if Britain made the declaration for creating Israel, these guys promised American support for World War I. And of course, there were a lot of people, against World War I.
Sure. Now,
Frankfurter brought in under him, his law clerk was Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson comes from that nest of secret societies of which Dr. Anthony Sutton was talking about.
Right.
His son becomes a member of Skull and Bones. That's David Champion Acheson. And he married the daughter of William Bundy, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was a member of the CIA for over 10 years.
Yeah.
You can combine these with the Masons, the Knights of Malta, the Skull and Bones, and the Zionist Secret Society, Parishim. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Parishim.
And again, it ties to the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, and such groups as Group Research and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And there's other things that you go back to Brandeis that affected the court. What was also I found that was important here is that when Woodrow Wilson had nominated Brandeis for Supreme Court, there were 22 senators voted against him. It was Walter Lippmann, who was part of the New York Socialist Party. He was on Colonel Mandel House's staff, and he was the one that campaigned for Brandeis's nomination. So you've got a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, you've got Skull and Bones, you've got Daniel Coit Gilman, who incorporated Skull and Bones. That brought both Sidney and Patrice Webb from the Fabian Society to the United States for several meetings. So you've got this conspiracy twined rope of secret societies, which includes the Zionist one, the Skull and Bones, which Sutton showed tangency with the Illuminati, and then the Fabian Society, which was Cecil Rhodes' massive money into the round tables, and I think the Rothschilds got some of that through history. But this was the building, or the setting off the Zionist movement through these secret societies against people's wishes, manipulated by the press and controlled by cooperation of secret societies.
Well,
so I'll let you go from
It's exactly right. Is that the secret societies have played a crucial role in creating Zionism and in spreading it throughout Eastern Europe as well. A very good source book for this information about these secret societies and Zionism is the Encyclopedia of Zionism in Israel, printed in Israel in 1971. It's a 2-volume set. And there's a whole section, of course, on secret societies and the Rothschilds. And there were secret societies operating in the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia and Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. That these secret societies, like the B'nai Moshe and of course the B'nai B'rith and other secret societies like Lovers of Zion, played a key role in fomenting this Zionist fervor among the Jewish communities that were in the Pale of Settlement. And this is when they started pushing this ideology onto the Jewish people that lived there. And in 1880 or something, 1890, there was a key rabbi in Poland, in a place called Białystok, which is northeast Poland, where in the encyclopedia explains that he was the first one who married the ideology of political Zionism with Orthodox Judaism. And when he merged those two things together, Zionism became the doctrine of the faith for Orthodox Jews. And this is what caused the first impetus of immigration to Palestine by the Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe. That the first wave of Aliyah. And these people were devoted, dedicated Zionists who believed that Jews needed to return to the Holy Land and create settlements there. And of course, the Rothschild family sponsored these secret societies like the B'nai Moshe, which were very, very secret societies. And then at the same time, the Rothschilds were funding the first 30 settlements in Palestine, places like Rishon LeZion, the first in Zion. They created those settlements for the people to come to. And so what you've told me here about the secret societies in the United States, this is what we see throughout Zionist history. The B'nai B'rith, for example, was created in 1843 in New York City. Secret societies play a key role in the whole creation of the Zionist fervor in Eastern Europe, and then setting the stage for the political process in the United States, whereby the United States got involved in First World War. Of course, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was addressed to Lord Rothschild, and it promised British support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But in 1843, the Rothschilds played a key role in the creation of B'nai B'rith in this country. The International Order of B'nai B'rith, Lodge number 1 is in New York City. And some of the key people in the founding of that lodge were, of course, the family of the New York Times, Sulzberger Ox. So you have the New York Times being basically a newspaper from the B'nai B'rith, or for the B'nai B'rith, where the B'nai B'rith ideas are distributed to the public. But the public doesn't know that the New York Times is a family-owned paper. And when they put in the upper corner the motto, all the news is fit to print, it's all the news that they see fit to print.
Sure.
But I mean, the secret societies played a key role in the creation of Zionism and in the establishment of the State of Israel.
You go back to the 1840s, and you've got August Beaumont involved with the Civil War itself in order to create as much chaos as they can in order to...
Yes, yes. Because these secret societies, like you pointed out, and like I said about the B'nai B'rith, and are able to basically conspire behind closed doors in complete secrecy in a free society.